one of the smart guys. And as I've gotten to know him, I found that that's true in very many ways. And one of the most amazing undertakings of his was the book that hopefully many of you have read in full, and hopefully all of you have at least started a little. I found this extremely compelling and emotional a story to tell the founding of the State of Israel through the eyes of his father, who had already died by the time Daniel had discovered the letters. And this was both a personal journey on a very deep level, but also a fascinating first-person introduction to what was going on in Palestine before it became the State of Israel. So without any other comments, I want to turn it over to Dan, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for writing this book.
Thanks very much, Don. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to speak with all of you today. I'm going to go to screen share. And one more click. Okay. First of all, I want to thank Don and Mackenzie Mager and Dan Kurtz of Maccabia USA for hosting me. As Don mentioned, I worked at Bernstein, and I was and remain an extremely happy client of Bernstein, and look forward to continuing to work together for a long time. I have two goals for this session. First of all, I want to share with you some select episodes in what I think is the most important event in Jewish history in the last 2,000 years, Israel's War of Independence and the reestablishment of the state. But maybe more importantly, my second goal is to demonstrate how intensely personal Jewish history is, and how every single one of us on this call has a personal stake in Jewish history and a relationship with Jewish history. So this is something we're going to talk about throughout this presentation. My father was the foreign news editor and war correspondent for the Palestine Post during the War of Independence, 1947 to 1949. And he was also a soldier in the Haganah, Israel's army at the time, which was very illegal. I had grown up with his stories, and basically I was pretty tired of them. Still, I encouraged him to write his memoirs. I edited them, I published them, I produced them, and they were interesting, but they were mostly based on anecdotes and some articles. He never said anything to me about letters. So when he died 6.5 years ago, I was a little shocked to find this cache of letters that included the letters that he wrote from Palestine and Israel during those 3 years, and also the responses he got from his family. They had saved everything. So at first I thought, okay, this is very nice. I'll just scan them and I'll preserve them for my children. And if they're interested, they'll look at them. But then I started to read them, and I was really amazed by what I found. First of all, I got excited by the opportunity of really learning something about Israel's War of Independence. I've lived in Israel now for over 30 years, and we live every day with the conflict with the Palestinians, and I thought, well, maybe coming to grips with the history will give me an opportunity to understand it better. And I was curious, how would my father's account of these events compare to the history books? What is history anyway? Here, I'm an amateur. I'm trained as an analyst and a communications executive. What do I know about history? So how do you even write history? And then how do you deal with personal eyewitness contemporaneous accounts, especially in our ideological and post-historical age? One of my favorite authors, historian Anita Shapiro, writes, autobiographical writing is an attempt to give expression to that fleeting moment, to freeze time, to perpetuate what happened in real time, before the historians and the writers and agents of memory expropriate the past and shape and control its shaping. I had an amazing opportunity. Suddenly, I had access to the raw materials of my father's memoirs. But then there are also the personal aspects. What would it be like to meet my father as a 25-year-old? In fact, novelist Ian McEwan writes, who wouldn't want to travel back in time and encounter their parents before they became their parents? Indeed, what an opportunity. I discovered that my father proposed to a woman, not my mother. And while he was waiting for her answer, he was, let's say, very close with another woman, and at the same time had his eyes on a third. My mother would not enter the picture for a few more years. Well, I found all three of these women or their descendants, as well as descendants of many of the other people discussed in the correspondence. I'm going to tell you about two of them. What I did was I took all of these strands, the historical, the personal, and the communal, and I wove them together in a book. And what I'd like to do is share excerpts of letters describing 4 specific events and their historical contexts. But first, I think we're going to take a slight break just to give so that we can have an historical background and get some context. So, to do this very, very quickly, I learned that when writing history, the first big question really is, how far do you go back? When did the war begin? Most people will say the war began with the declaration of the state on May 14th, and then the invasion by the Arab armies immediately thereafter. But I think it started really much earlier with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. What Lord Balfour famously wrote was, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. So, as I'm sure you know, Britain was awarded the mandate to administer parts of the Palestine district of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And specifically, they were obligated to implement the Balfour Declaration. It's really hard to exaggerate how widespread was worldwide support for the creation of a national homeland in Palestine. During the period from 1918 till 1948, there were something like 6 efforts to solve the Jewish-Arab problem. And we're going to talk about the most important, which was the UN Special Committee on Palestine. But ultimately, historians have fastened on 2 specific phases. I'm just looking for annotation. I don't see how to do it. Okay, no matter. Here, can you see the cursor? Yes? Okay. So they fastened on 2 specific phases. The Civil War, which was the period from the UN vote for partition through the declaration of the state. And that part was between the local Arab and local Jewish inhabitants. And then the conventional war, which began with the declaration of the state and then the Arab invasion. This is a rough declaration, a rough description of the periods of the war. Now, my father moved from New York to Palestine in early February 1947 when he was 25. And he quickly got a job at the Palestine Post and a month later became its foreign news editor. Shortly after, he was recruited into the Haganah, which was Israel's secret and illegal army. And the letters that my father wrote during 1947 were largely about illegal immigration and various chapters in British mandatory history. And in the spring of 1947, the UN sent a fact-finding mission, UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, to analyze the situation and to come up with a recommendation. My father traveled with them throughout Israel, and he reported on their progress. As I'm sure you know, their final recommendation was to partition Palestine, that's after carving out Jordan, to partition it between the Jews and the Arabs. And on November 29th, 1947, the UN voted to partition. And this was the crucial step in the reconstitution of the Jewish state. My father wrote a very long description of that night, of the night of the UN vote and the following day. He wrote it in Hebrew, apparently in a single sitting. It's filled with biblical and Talmudic allusions, and it is really gorgeous. This is what the original Hebrew looked like, just a portion of it. It was translated by my daughter, Rachel, and it's incredibly rich, but I can only share a few excerpts. So let me read to you a little bit from it. He begins, "And it came to pass at midnight, and a Redeemer has come unto Zion. My dear family, Friday afternoon before Shabbat, we sat crowded together and fearful around our huge radio in the newspaper office and heard the proposal to postpone the vote. Our eyes dimmed and our blood froze in our veins. We walked through the silent and sad streets of Jerusalem and found no comfort. We envisioned military posts at every corner and machine guns, explosions and sirens and terror and suffering renewed. Then comes a clear Shabbat morning under the scalding sun, and the people walk about with some sort of hope and prayer on their lips as they stream to the Western Wall to pray with the chief rabbis. Friends on the street and in the cafes ask me, the journalist, how will the debate end? What will the night bring? And I answer their prayers with a quiet, Yeh beseder, it'll be okay. Dr. Arancha, the Secretary of the General Assembly, begins, and the delegate from Lebanon speaks, and another, and yet another, and after that, Gromyko, the Russian delegate, hero of the Hebrew state, demands a vote. And suddenly, amid all the chaos, the chairman announces a vote not regarding the proposal to delay, but on partition itself. We sat glued to our seats, each of us with a piece of paper to calculate the prophecy, and pen in hand, and alluding to the Yom Kippur liturgy, my father writes, thus he would count, 1, 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, until 33, the needed 2/3 vote, and a great joyous cry and silence. The silence of the moment we've been waiting for 2,000 years. And the narrow smoke-filled room, heavy with tension and oppressive concern, one long sigh of relief, a silent mazal tov from the depths of the heart. We left the room, each to his work, and within 15 minutes, the first newspapers went to print. Blessed are we who live in this time and stand in the Holy Land at the time of the great declaration. We embrace, and tears of joy glimmer in each eye. Jerusalem, dead and deserted at night, is resurrected. We heard a tremendous roar from Ben Yehuda Street. David Melech Yisrael, Chai V'Kayam, and the roar is repeated again and again from the throats of the youth of Jerusalem, banding together in a huge horror around an armored police car. I left the office with a young woman who had come to hear the news with me, and we raced up the street. We ran and we danced, and we ran and we laughed and cried interchangeably, without even noticing our tears. We got in a large truck with a great crowd, and we were like grains of sand, people swarming to the Jewish Agency building, followed him to the Jewish Agency. This is the Jewish Agency building where my father is sitting above it. Suddenly, the blue and white flag appeared on the balcony, and a jubilant and fresh hatikva, which we had never dared to hope for and never anticipated, erupted from 5,000 mouths. And after that, Golda, Golda, Golda. And she appears and speaks simply and touchingly. One old man, tears streaming down, covering his face and disappearing into his white beard, mutters to a 6 or 7-year-old grandson, remember this is what I waited 40 years for, tears and laughter intertwined. Even now, 24 hours after the birth of the state, I sit writing in the office, waiting to finish the second edition, and it is as if a lump is stuck in my throat, and I fear I will burst into tears at any moment. Unseemly for a hard-hearted journalist. And we have already paid with our first victims. 7 Jews were murdered today, and who knows how great the number will grow until the day of peace will come to us. But there are no doubts whatsoever. Anyone who heard the Ani Ma'amin, I believe, of the celebrating people, and saw the people striding through the streets of Jerusalem does not fear what is to come. Truly, everything will be okay. Soon I'll go to bed without any sleep at all after 2 days, but I'm not tired. This great miracle stands before me and robs me of sleep. We must be worthy of it. Good night, With much love and great and blinding joy, Mordecai Shmuel. The whole letter is much longer, and it's in the book. So I would say that we Jews have an historical consciousness. We're never satisfied with simply telling a story, but we often feel like we have to reenact it. Like on Pesach, when we have the Seder, and we reenact leaving Egypt, or on Sukkot, on Shavuot, where we receive the Torah, or Sukkot, where we live in sukkahs. Having a vivid eyewitness account really helps us to experience what it's like and the emotions that they generate. Now, this UN vote was really the starting bell for the Civil War. Since it was illegal for Jews to have any arms or an army, it was very difficult for the Jews at the time to defend themselves. In addition, the Arabs put the Jewish parts of Jerusalem under siege in order to starve it into surrender. During the first months of 1948, there were increasing attacks on convoys trying to bring supplies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The city was starving. In January 1948, there were 30 trucks per day supplying Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. 3 months later, there were none. Now, how the city survived is an incredible story in itself. I wrote a blog post about it that you can read on the Times of Israel or on my website. It's an amazing story. But on January 19th, a convoy going up from Kibbutz Ma'aleh HaChamisha to Jerusalem was attacked. The 3 Jews were killed and many were wounded. The New York Times mentions the attack, but only in the context of their story on punitive action taken by the Zionists. One of my father's closest friends in Palestine was a young woman from Ohio named Ann Strauss. She was secretary to Dr. Chaim Yaski, who was the head of Hadassah Hospital, and Ann had a boyfriend. Alter Chaim Repnitz was born in 1914 in Poland. He lost his entire family in the Holocaust and was a founding member of his kibbutz. He was a farmer, but well known for his strong aesthetic sense. My father wrote about their relationship and described the attack on their convoy in a tribute that he wrote to them. I'm going to share just a few sentences. Alter's chofesh, his vacation from the kibbutz, was due, and so on Sunday morning they climbed into one of the 3 trucks which made up the convoy and found seats for themselves among the crates of fruit and cans of milk the kibbutz was sending to Jerusalem. It was a bright, dry winter's day, a winter chamsin or hot spell, which burns all the cold and dampness out of one's bones and erases all memory of rain and the mud and Jerusalem's hailstorms. It was a clear day, and the attacking Arabs were in full view as they shot at the convoy from the hills. The driver of the truck they were in was hit, and he lost control of his vehicle, which skidded into a ditch, breaking the ropes, holding the freight, and sending it all into a heap on top of the hidden armaments. With the first shots, Alter pushed her from her precarious seat and stretched out across her body, trying to shield her from the shots. He saved her life and gave his own. He was hit in the head and chest, and he was dead when Magen David Adom picked him up and put him on a stretcher. She only knew that he'd been hit. She had felt his hot blood soaking through her clothing as she lay there on the floor of the truck. She was still pleading to see him, asking how badly he was hurt, when an injection put her to sleep, and she was taken from the first aid building to Hadassah Hospital. She'll be told all too soon. A young man died a hero's death, but that's slight consolation to the girl who loved him. Now, if you've driven from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you've noticed the old burned out armored cars on the side of the road. Those are memorials to exactly these kinds of convoys. Now, to bring you up to date, Anne eventually married, and I found her son, Roy. When we met, I asked him for more details of the attack, but he couldn't tell me anything. He knew that it had happened, but he had no details. His mother wouldn't talk about it, just like many Holocaust survivors. So I offered to share my father's story. I read it to him. We sat there together and we just cried. He had brought some photographs of his mother, and he showed me a lovely picture of his mother standing with Alter and another man. And he said, I don't know who this other guy is. And I said, yeah, that's my father. So it's just amazing that we had this together. Now, Anne's boss, Dr. Yaski, was murdered a few months later on April 13th in the attack on the doctor's convoy. This was a weekly convoy between Hadassah Hospital on the French Hill, which was an island in an otherwise Arab neighborhood, and central Jerusalem. 81 Jewish medical personnel were massacred. Anne was supposed to have gone with Dr. Yaski, but he asked her to stay back to finish some paperwork. This, no doubt, saved her life. Now, 2 weeks later was my father's turn. On February 2nd, the Palestine Post was bombed, and my father was in the building when the bomb went off. I want to share with you how the British reported it. This is an old newsreel I found. It's 1 minute long, and it really takes us back to that time. So here it is, 1 minute.
From Jerusalem come pictures of the latest outrage. This time it's understood to be the result of a bomb placed by Arab terrorists. The offices of the Palestine Post, the Zionist daily published in English, were partly demolished and set on fire. A score of people were injured, and the flames, which spread rapidly, not only made rescue difficult, but also gave the firefighters a very tough job. The fire raged for several hours, and after it had been dealt with, the street soon had all the appearance of an evacuation. Property which had been salvaged littered the pavements, for a block of flats in this Jewish quarter of the old city had also been involved in the conflagration.
So that's the way the British reported it on their newsreel. Now, my father wrote a 4,500 word description of the event. It's probably the most detailed eyewitness description of exactly what happened that night. It's gripping, but it's much too long to read in its entirety. So I'm going to share a few selections with you and also share an incredibly moving personal aspect to it. So this is the letter he wrote to his family in New York. Dear everybody, one of the boys was walking along Prince Mary Avenue Sunday night when he heard a terrific explosion, and he heard somebody shout out from a police armored car that was just passing, well, that's the end of the bloody Palestine Post. There was a burst of laughter. The voice was wrong. Somebody dashed over to Haganah headquarters and reported that 100 people had been killed, but miraculously, he too was wrong. I had been sitting in the newsroom at the time. I ran down to the press and in the dark saw a figure sitting on the floor. I called in, Mise, who's this? And the fellow with whom I work and next to whom I invariably stand at 11 o'clock at night answered. I ripped down a door to make a path for us. I saw he needed help, but how much, I couldn't tell yet. And I rushed in. He was dripping wet, and having recognized my voice, he kept moaning, Mordecai, kach oti lemagin David. Mordecai, take me to the aid station. I grabbed him by the shoulders and held on while I yelled for a stretcher. Hugh Orgill of our foreign news staff came by, and together we got Robbie onto the stretcher, and we carried him the 100 yards or so to the clinic and up a flight of stairs to the aid room. Then we ran back, and I draped someone's arm around my shoulders, and I dragged him to the aid station also. By the light of 2 burning buildings, I saw a street which looked like blitzed London. Pieces of wall, balconies, clothing, a child's doll, and shutters were scattered all about. The body of the truck, which had brought the explosive, was blown across the street in one direction, and its motor sat in a crater next to the building. As I walked by, I heard an English soldier say, I guess it'll be weeks before the Palestine Post comes out again. I didn't like his tone, so I snapped back at him. Not even days. We'll be out tomorrow, even if we have to write it out longhand. And then, with Dove, went up to the Café Atara. Someone had said, go over to Lipschitz, a printing shop. We're putting out a paper. And then with one linotype machine, we went to work. A dozen correspondents brought typewriters. Everybody pitched in. And half asleep on our feet, we got the paper together. And at 6 a.m, the Palestine Post appeared. Smaller than usual, but it appeared. And for the morale of the yeshuv, of the community, it was a great thing. People couldn't believe it. It was too much to produce a paper from memory starting at 1:30 in the morning after the hell that we had been through bordered on the miraculous. But we did it. There were people in Jerusalem who did not know that the Post had been destroyed until they read about it in the Post. One of the linotypers died the following morning. The man I carried in, Rabbi, is on the border as I write. If he lives, his 3 beautiful little children, whom he used to run with in Rechavia on sunny Shabbat afternoons, will have a blind father. You can appreciate how terrible blindness would be to him. Hasolel Street is now digging itself out. Stores are back in business while repair work goes on. One bookshop, Atid, advertised more open than usual and kept going even without one day off for repairs. Now, 2 days later, my father wrote a follow-up with more details. Among them, Rabbi, my favorite down in the press, will live. I understand that there's even a slight chance for one of his eyes. Well, Rabbi, my father's favorite pressman, eventually succumbed to his wounds. The youngest of Rabbi's 3 beautiful children is a guy named David Navo, a very successful high-tech and defense industry executive. He never knew his father. He was too young when his father died. He's a little bit obsessed with the issue of the bombing and what happened. He's researched it, he interviewed people, but he had very few details. Suddenly, I show up, I'm a stranger, with an eyewitness account written by someone who loved his father and who pulled him out of the rubble. You can't imagine how emotional it was. For both David and I to meet and to share information about our fathers. And we've stayed in close touch since we had that first meeting. Now, 3.5 months later, on May 14th, David Ben-Gurion formally declared the establishment of the state. And the following day, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria all attacked, and the conventional war began. There are no rousing letters describing the declaration. For one thing, there was almost no mail service, and for another thing, they couldn't breathe. They had no time to breathe. A year later, my father wrote a description. I'm just going to share 3 sentences. Jerusalem didn't celebrate the declaration of the state. There were no parades and no banquets. All manpower not essential to the city's vital industries had been mobilized. There was little enough food in the city to keep real hunger away, let alone for celebration. After all, Jerusalem had already been at war for 4.5 months. There was no food, no water beyond the pails full we got every day. Jerusalem was a desolate city, bristling with roadblocks and dragon's teeth. Jerusalem was a tent city. Every Jew in the city was alerted. Men were lined up, ready to fight. Now, less than a week after the declaration of the state, on May 20th, my father wrote an article describing how the Palmach, that was Israel's elite commander unit, took the Zion Gate entrance to the old city. As a result of this article, the Palmach loved him, and they adopted him and invited him to travel with him. This is, I think, one of the early examples of being embedded in wartime. My father loved the Palmach, and he wrote extensively on their exploits. In one letter, he writes to his parents, "Let me tell you something about my unit, Haportzim. They are heroes, every last one of them. I would obey an order from their lowest officer. They value each life very highly, and the result is a job very well planned and very well executed, and almost invariably successful. You can't imagine how proud I am that they've taken me in and see fit to consider me okay." Last night, Azariah, he was the war correspondent for Haaretz. Last night, Azariah and I were given a note by Yitzhak Rabin, the 27-year-old commander of the Jerusalem district, simply saying, "Take these 2 men to Tel Aviv, they're okay, and they help us." Now, this note allowed my father to participate in one of the most amazing and dramatic stories of the War of Independence, the creation of the Burma Road. This is the road that enabled the breaking of the siege of Jerusalem. Now, earlier I had told you about attacks on the convoys trying to bring food and arms to Jerusalem, like the one in which Anne and Alter were killed. Anne was wounded and Alter was killed. The Jews had made many, many attempts to open the road and to break the siege, including military operations Nachshon, Harel, Yevusi, and Maccabi. The problem was, the main choke point here at Latrun. You see this? This is the main road this is to Tel Aviv, and this is to Jerusalem. But the road passes too close to Latrun, and the Arabs were able to shoot all the time. Now, if you go along this road now, at Latrun, there is the Armored Museum. There's lots to see in this area. You should visit the Castel, which is a very important fort that the Jews were able to take. And maybe more importantly, if you go to the area, you should visit the Castel Winery, which is one of the best in Israel. But Ben-Gurion understood how devastating the fall of Jerusalem would be. He said that if the land of Israel is the heart of the Jewish nation, then Jerusalem is its heart of hearts. There had to be a way to avoid this stretch of road. Ben-Gurion ordered the army to find an alternative route. My father wrote a very exciting description of the finding and the development of the road. The article opens, "It began with 3 men on foot moving down through the Judean hills in the darkness to the thunder of cannon and crack of rifles at Latrun. The 3 were picked from Palmach's Haportzim, the unit which had learned every inch of the way during the original road clearing operations, Nachshon and Maccabi. My father was at the base camp from which the men set out." Now, here's the road. This is the road they found. The problem was, you can't see from this map that there's a 100-foot drop. There's a huge grade here. So trucks would come in from here, and they'd only get like this far. They'd have to unload their convoy and then move it by porter to trucks waiting on this side, where it would continue to the rest on the rest of the road. Now, what happened was, 2 nights later, my father and Azariah set out from the same path. And during this period, the Jews were working frantically to make that steep part of the road navigable for trucks and to connect up these 2 sections. The work included laying a pipeline for water, because the Arabs had also cut off all the water to Jerusalem. They finished all this work by the 10th of June, and that's when the road was able to open. There are many fascinating twists and turns in the story, but we don't have time to discuss them in detail. My father's account ends like this. 3 men went walking on a cloudy summer's night down the hills of Judea, and the siege of Jerusalem was broken. Jerusalem has its own lifeline to the coast. Now, next time you go to Israel, you should visit the Burma Road. It's an amazing hike. It's well marked, and it's incredibly interesting. Now, by the summer of 1948, my father was in the army full-time in various intelligence positions. He no longer had any time to write for the Post. His last assignment was to edit a publication for Anglo Army volunteers. Now, to finish the chronology very quickly and to skip ahead, after the war, my father took a position as a press officer, and he met my English mother, whom he married in 1951. My mother had been in the British Army during World War II, and then went to Marseille to look for survivors from her family. She ended up in Israel, where she met my father. And then the 2 of them moved to US temporarily, but of course it became permanent. My father became a pulpit rabbi in Israel and then worked for various Zionist organizations until I brought him back to Israel for the last 6 years of his life. Now, I never got a really good answer for why he left, why he didn't come back. I have my own ideas, and I explore it at length in the last chapter of my book. But still, no matter what, he left a really great Zionist legacy. At this point, three grandchildren, all of whom served in the Israeli army, their spouses, and 8 great-grandchildren all live in Israel. So even if my father didn't live in Israel most of his life, he still left a very, very strong Zionist legacy and a wonderful account of a very important historical period. I want to conclude just with a couple of thoughts about this issue of history and memory. For Jews, the two are really tightly bound up with one another. The philosopher David Hartman writes, "Parents provide their children with luggage. Whether they open this luggage in the future and use its contents is beyond the knowledge and control of the parents." I consider myself incredibly lucky. My father left me an amazing suitcase filled with history, stories, incredible people, and artifacts. I've not only opened it, but I've internalized his memories. They've become my memories. Finding the letters and writing the book had a huge impact on me. Only now I'm beginning to understand what he went through. I deeply respect what he experienced and he contributed, and his efforts to understand the situation, the people, and himself, even if he didn't get everything right. I think my father, my wife always said that my father was like Zelig or Forrest Gump. He just happened to be in Israel during its most amazing period. And he described these events, and events that turn out to be important, not just to him and to me, but people that you've met in this presentation, like Roy Shankar and David Naveau, and many others that I haven't been able to expose to you. But I argue that these stories apply to you as well. If you're Jewish or not, if you're on this call, and if this subject interests you, then you have a stake in this history. So I would say that all of these stories, the how and the why, are really important to all of us. So I think that's enough. I'm going to stop, and I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone may have.
As people are posting questions on the chat, why don't I start? First of all, thank you, Daniel. I get verklempt every time I look at the book or listen to you, so thank you. What in looking at and thinking of your experience of discovering these letters, what were the two biggest surprises? One in terms of history, something that you didn't really know or didn't fully understand or know, and then in terms of your father. So and one of the things you say near the end of the book is that writing a history like this is there's two stories, right? There's the story itself, and then there's the experience of the writer. So could you give us a sense, two biggest surprises, one historical and the other in terms of your father?
Well, it's a wonderful question, Don, and there really are a lot of surprises. I would say that reading the letters and reading my father's relations and emotional response to historical events caused me to do a lot of research. And one of the things I never really understood was the relationship of the British and their role and how ambivalent their role was. It's something that I'm trying to come to grips with now. So that's one. And I want to tell you a specific other historic issue that I never really fully understood, which is that during this whole time period, it was never clear to me why was it that there couldn't be a peace plan. And I read the memoirs of many, many people who were intimately involved, including the British general, the UN mediator, and I kept reading about the Arab resistance to the existence of a Jewish state in any part of Israel. And reading my father's responses to that and the frustration of trying to create a Jewish state when there was resistance, to a Jewish state in any part of it was a real eye-opener to me.
Thank you.
On the personal level, I think just getting to see my father as a young man and reading about his insecurities and reading about the relationships and reading his descriptions of the different people that he met, and then getting in touch with these people. The woman that he proposed to, I found. She's still alive. She's very old. I called her, And I said, I'm trying to reach Hadassah Frisch. And she says, this is Hadassah. I said, Hadassah, my name is Daniel Chertoff. My father was Mordecai Chertoff. And there's a silence. And I'm terrified that she's had a heart attack or something. And then she yells out, oh my God. And then we started to chat. And she said, you know, your father liked me. I said, Hadassah, my father liked you. My father proposed to you. She said, well, yes, he did. And she told me that this was very hard for her and that would I please speak to her daughter. And her daughter has become a very good friend. And her daughter explained to me that her mother continued to kind of keep track of my father and monitor his history and evolution since then. And it was lovely to kind of close the circle by being in touch at this very late stage. So the personal stories were really, for me, the high point of all of this research.
Fascinating. If anyone on the call has a question, either post it on the chat or you could unmute yourself and ask it live. Don't be shy. Let's give them a second.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Daniel, number one, I'd like to say that I'm delighted that you wrote this book. It's an incredibly important piece of history. I feel when I'm listening to it, and as I look through your book, like I'm actually participating in that time period and driving my truck up to Bab el Wad where they were getting shot and so on. You mentioned in your book that your dad was very involved with the Haganah and the Palmach, but yet I see in your bibliography you're quoting from a lot of the Etzel, Irgun sources. I just wanted to hear your comments about it, because there is, of course, people that know that time period understand the diverse political perspective from Ben-Gurion and from Menachem Begin, etc. I was fortunate to have met Begin many times, and I'm a very big follower of Begin, so I'm just curious about that.
That's also an important point. First of all, my father, during this time period, loathed Begin and the Irgun. Much of what he wrote about, he felt that the Irgun undermined the Haganah, and both militarily and politically. However, over time, and my father, by the way, was present at Begin's famous speech at Kikar Tzion, and describes it in his letters, describes Begin as a demagogue, but he did come to really admire Begin. He felt that Begin was a man of tremendous integrity. As to my sources, I used many sources, but I'm going to give you one example. The whole historical event of the massacre at Deir Yassin is extremely controversial. Now, I read Begin's account, but I also read a very recent account written by a guy named George Tauber, but I read many other accounts. And this is an example of history constantly being reevaluated and being reconsidered. So I think with the benefit of time, a lot of things get to evolve. In my book, I describe other events that my father describes and has some judgments about, but later turns out to have been wrong. We simply didn't know, or more sources became available. So it's an evolving process, and every event justifies a new history being written every few years, certainly Israeli history.
I also congratulate you on getting a blip from Yossi Klein Halevi, who's a good friend of mine, who gave me a blip for my book as well. Congratulations.
And Alec, you preempted me. I was going to explain to everyone who you were, Alex Sternberg, who wrote the book that we profiled in our last book club called Recipes from Auschwitz. Did I get that right?
I've heard of it. I know the book. Lovely.
Yeah. Okay, who else? Jocelyn, did you want to ask a question or just saying hello?
Oh, I'd like to tell you that this was an extremely motivating, moving book for me. I wound up reading it all on Saturday, since we can't go to shul because of the area we're in now. However, I seem to get the impression that things have not changed vis-a-vis the media. Your dad's letters contradict, in many cases, what the media was telling the world. That concerns me. The other item that I found extremely interesting is the fact that your dad seems to have felt so strongly about Israel, and the fact that he didn't stay there or move there was extremely disappointing to me in reading it. However, your last chapter sort of explained it in some way.
Yeah, well, first of all, your comment about the media, I think, is really important. There is a part of my book where I describe a column that the Palestine Post used to run called How They See Us. And it was an early example of describing media bias. Like, here's what really happened, here's how the AP described it, and I gave a little example when I described how the New York Times described the attack on the convoy in which Alter was killed. So there's nothing new. Media has always been partisan and ideological. My father was worried about it then. He also reflects his anxiety about censorship. So I think it's a problem. I think we live in times when it's gone really to a very, very far extreme, where the media has become extremely partisan. As to why my father didn't stay, I can only speculate. I asked him, I never got a really good response. And I think this is something that's true of many people. I will tell you that the last 6 years of my father's life when he was here, he was extremely happy. We saw him quite a lot. He watched great-grandchildren being born, and he probably regrets not having been here. But I understand his motivation at the time. He felt a certain fate that he had to be a pulpit rabbi in America, and that there was no escaping that fate, even though his father encouraged him otherwise. So it's a bit sad, but you know, at least he had the last few years.
Dan, there was a question posted about whether you ever found Kepi or any of her descendants, or know anything more about her.
I'm so happy to get that question. I couldn't find her. And I came out of my office once and I complained to my wife, you know, I cannot find this woman. Who was she? And my wife said very kindly, go back into your office and don't come out until you find her. And then 2 days later, I had already been in touch with Kepi's sister-in-law. And I began to penetrate, basically by reviewing immigration records and census records. And then obituaries, I was able to find Kepi's brother. And through a long, convoluted process, thank God for the internet, was able to finally find the family. Eventually, I got an email from a woman saying, who are you? What do you want? Why are you stalking my family? You know, who are you? It was Kepi's daughter. So I wrote back and I explained, and she said, oh, when can we speak? How about now? So I did discover Kepi and learned quite a bit about her, and have become very, very close with Kepi's daughter, Lydia, and discovered that Kepi had had a very difficult life. She was a brilliant woman. She had gone to Radcliffe, was a very good writer, and she just had a very hard life. And I elected not to identify the family, just to protect them a bit. But Lydia was able to shed a lot more light on the family and her relationship. Lydia grew up hearing that her mother had been in love with some man in Palestine and that it hadn't worked out. So this is one of the other relationships that have come as a result of doing this research. It's one of my, it's a real treasure to have gotten to know Lydia, and our relationship has moved beyond just the book, but we get together whenever we're in Boston, and it was a real privilege to get to know her and hear firsthand about a woman who I think my father loved, and who, for whatever reason, didn't pursue a relationship with.
Thank you, Dan. If no one else has any other questions,
Don, I'd like to ask a question.
Go ahead, Dan.
So much of this is based on finding this treasure trove of personal writings. I'm curious, before finding that, were you a journaler or a letter writer? And since finding it, do you feel, besides obviously writing this book itself, are you keeping track in writing as you go and you continue your research?
That's a great question. I always have kept a journal since I'm a teenager, and I like writing. I find that writing helps me think, and as Daniel Borstein, who was the Librarian of Congress, at one point said, I write to find out what I think. So I think that's true for me as well. And doing the research for the book has been an incredible joy, and it's given me a lot of, it's made me interested and curious in a lot of different chapters, which I'm pursuing now via my column in the Times of Israel. So there are a number of articles there that explore the Burma Road and some of the peace plans. So yes, I'm happy to continue that. But I'm going to also answer something that you didn't ask, which is I've been asked a few times, do you think your father forgot about the letters or he intentionally didn't tell you? And this is something I've really thought a lot about. And while I believe in my heart of hearts that my father forgot about the letters, I like to think that he didn't forget and that he intended for me to discover them when he wouldn't be around to answer questions, and that it would force me to then explore and to find David Neveu and talk about his father, the linotype operator, and Anne Strauss and what it was like for her, and Kepi. So I'm grateful that he didn't tell me, because I simply would have read them and asked him explain this, explain that, and then I would have had his commentary. Instead, I had the benefit of his raw material from which I am able to fashion my own version of what he read through, my own interpretation. And I would argue that all of us who have a relationship with Jewish history need to develop our own interpretations. Maybe I've taken it a little, extreme, but I think it's really true of all of us. We all develop our own interpretations.
Dan, thank you. And Dan, thanks for that great question. And I just want to take this opportunity, especially for those who this is your first connection to Maccabi USA. We are all about building and strengthening the Jewish community and support for Israel. This book we thought was a beautiful way to educate and inspire some of our younger and some of our older alumni and athletes. And want to thank you all for joining us. We have many of these programs, so if you check out our website, you see every week we have all sorts of interesting speakers, some historical, many contemporary, dealing with all sorts of issues about Jewish pride and Israel and Jewish excellent athletes. So I just want to thank everyone for participating and being here today. I want to thank Debbie Adams for creating this book club. Thank you, Debbie, and our past book authors, and stay tuned for the next one. So we hope to see you again soon. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Don. And again, on behalf of Maccabi USA, thank you everybody so much for joining us this afternoon. I just want to give everybody a preview really quick about the two remaining events this week. Tomorrow, we will have Bruce Pearl, who is the head coach of Auburn University's men's basketball team, on our sports show hosted by Donna Orender and Arnie Fielkow. So please do join us. There is time to register, which can be done on our website, MaccabiUSA.com. And then this coming Saturday at 9:15 Eastern, Rabbi Dan Graber, who is a Maccabi USA alum, as well was our team rabbi from 2013 and 2017 Maccabia Games, will be hosting Havdalah. So please join us for those two events, and thank you so much for your support. Daniel, thank you for taking the time this evening to speak with us about your wonderful, wonderful book. And we hope that you will continue to stay in touch with Maccabi USA. And next time you're in the States, please do come to Philadelphia and stop by. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope everyone has a remaining wonderful Monday. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.